In this lesson, we're going to review 45, 45, 90 triangles. Now, I know this is a topic we've already seen, but this is super important moving forward, especially into pre-calculus and on. So there's a pattern that happens when you have 45, 45, 90 triangles. So if you remember, a 45, 45, 90 triangle is really describing the angle measures, right? We're talking about two 45-degree angles and a 90-degree angle. Now, because those angles are congruent, remember that means we have congruent sides. So all of these are actually called right isosceles triangles. So here's what's happening. If you look at the blue triangle here, right, they have that the two legs are of side length 2. So what they did was they did the Pythagorean theorem, and they found that the hypotenuse was 2 radical 2. Then they did the same thing for a side length of 3. Okay, both legs would be 3. Follow through with the Pythagorean theorem, and you get 3 radical 2. Then they did it for a side length of 4. So both my legs are 4. You do the Pythagorean theorem, solve for the hypotenuse, and you get 4 radical 2. So the conclusion that was drawn is that whatever the legs measure, the hypotenuse, which is the longest side and across from the 90-degree angle, is always going to equal the leg times the radical 2. Now, if I were you, I would draw this picture out, pause the video, draw the picture out on a piece of paper so that way you have it with you. Because it's easiest if you can have that next to you at all times. So we're going to go through several problems here. Some of them are going to be more straightforward. Others are going to make you work with radicals a little bit. All right, so here's our first triangle. Okay, I'm going to sketch this out real quick. Okay, I'm not going to do this every time, but we know here's my 45, 45, 90 triangle. On my problem here, I'm given a 5, which is a leg, right? So that means this leg must also be 5. To find the hypotenuse, okay, according to my formula triangle over here, if I know the leg, I just need to take and put it in front of a radical 2, so multiply it by radical 2 in order to find the hypotenuse. So since my leg is 5, my hypotenuse is going to be 5 radical 2. If I had a triangle whose leg, let's say, is 7, both legs would have to be 7, and the hypotenuse would have to be 7 radical 2. In this example here, I'm going to go ahead and draw out a triangle again. We have x, x, and x radical 2. All right, so in this example here, they give us the 6 radical 2. That 6 radical 2 is opposite of the right angle. Therefore, it is the hypotenuse. If I can work backwards and solve for x, that would be the leg. So what I'm going to do, because these are equivalent, I'm going to set them equal to each other. So 6 radical 2 is equivalent to x radical 2 on my formula triangle. Anytime I'm trying to solve for x, I need to get it by itself. So I'm going to divide by a radical 2. Okay, now here's the trick. Radical 2 divided by radical 2, that's a unit of 1. Right? So we just have x is equal to 6. So our side length here is 6, which makes sense because if I were going from my leg to my hypotenuse, I would just put the leg with a radical 2. All right, the next one. Again, we have the hypotenuse, right? And our hypotenuse is x radical 2. Okay, so I'm going to take 3 radical 2 and set that equal to x radical 2. Again, because x radical 2 is the hypotenuse on my formula triangle, and 3 radical 2 is the hypotenuse on my problem here. I'm going to solve for x by dividing by a radical 2. Okay, the radical 2's cancel each other out. So we have x is equal to 3. Okay, on this next problem, I again have a hypotenuse. So let's think about our formula triangle again. Okay, so my hypotenuse is 5. It's equivalent to x radical 2. So same process. I'm going to set 5 equal to x radical 2. I still want to divide by a radical 2. Now, the catch is I don't have a radical 2 in my numerator to cancel out the radical 2 in my denominator. So right now I have x is equal to 5 divided by radical 2. If you remember way back from like the beginning of the year, I believe you guys studied radicals. You can't have a radical in your denominator. It's like having bad grammar. Okay, so we have to do what's called rationalizing the denominator. So because there's a radical 2 in my denominator, I'm going to multiply both numerator and denominator by radical 2 over radical 2. So whatever that radical is in the denominator, that's what I'm going to multiply by here. Okay, and we do that because that's just a unit of 1. Remember, radical 2 divided by radical 2 is 1. So if I multiply by 1, it doesn't change the overall value. So let's multiply our numerators. So I have 5 times radical 2. And then in my denominator, I have radical 2 times radical 2. So a little side note over here. Radical 2 times radical 2 would give me radical 4. And the square root of 4 is 2. So the whole purpose in doing this is to get really rid of that radical in the denominator. So my answer, the length of my leg, is 5 radical 2 over 2 because we have x by itself. We're going to do a couple of those. That's probably the trickiest that these get. All right, so again, we have 12 is my hypotenuse. And if we think about my formula triangle, that is equivalent to x radical 2 on my formula triangle. So we have x radical 2 is equal to 12. I need to get x by itself, so I divide by a radical 2. Now, again, poor form here, right? We can't have a radical 2 in our denominator, so I need to rationalize it. I'm going to multiply by a radical 2 over radical 2. So in my numerator, I have 12 times a radical 2. In my denominator, I have a 2. Now, last time we were done, but this time I need to look at 12 divided by 2. Because 12 is an even number, it is divisible by 2. So 12 divided by 2 is 6. So my answer is really 6 radical 2. So both legs here are going to be 6 radical 2. Okay, one more like that. Let's go ahead and do one more. So thinking about, I have a hypotenuse here. My hypotenuse is equivalent to x radical 2. Okay, so I have x radical 2 is equivalent to 8. Divide both sides by radical 2. So I have x is equal to 8 divided by radical 2. I have to rationalize that denominator because I can't leave it down there. So multiply by a radical 2 over radical 2. In my numerator, I have 8 radical 2. In my denominator, I have 2. Okay, now I have to decide, is 8 divisible by 2? Yes, it is. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. So this simplifies to 4 radical 2. So both of my legs are equivalent to 4 radical 2. Okay, now a little side note here. We can double check ourselves, right? Because if I know my leg and I want to go from my leg to my hypotenuse, I can just multiply by a radical 2. So is 4 radical 2 times a radical 2, is that equivalent to 8? We can double check. Well, we have 4 times radical 2 is radical 4. And we know the square root of 4 is actually 2. So 8 is equivalent to 8. So we know we did the right math there. Okay, so you can always kind of go back and double check yourself. All right, so let's go back now. This time I have a 6, but it's not my hypotenuse. This is just a leg, right? So thinking about our formula triangle, we're given a leg. I want the hypotenuse. Okay, so I just need to take my leg, which is 6, and multiply it by a radical 2. So my answer is 6 radical 2. Okay, so this time I'm given the hypotenuse, right? So on my formula triangle, the hypotenuse is x radical 2. So I'm going to set that equal to 2 radical 2. I want to solve for the legs. I need to get x by itself. I'm going to divide both sides by a radical 2. Okay, so when I do that, this is nice. I have a radical 2 divided by radical 2 is just 1. So my answer is 2. So the leg lengths here are 2. Okay, next one. I have a radical 6 for my legs. I want to find the hypotenuse. So if I know my leg and I want my hypotenuse, I just need to multiply by a radical 2. So I need to take the leg times a radical 2. So my leg is radical 6. I need to take that times a radical 2. So radical 2 times radical 6 gives me radical 12. Now, we have to be careful here too, because radical 12 really isn't the answer. It needs to be simplified further. So we got to think about those perfect squares. This would be equivalent to radical 4 times radical 3, right? And the square root of 4 is 2. So we get 2 radical 3 is our hypotenuse. Next one, the 8s. Those are my legs again. So to go from the leg to the hypotenuse, I need to multiply by a radical 2. So I need to take 8 times a radical 2, and I get 8 radical 2. Okay, again, I have a leg. So to find the hypotenuse, I need to take radical 5 times radical 2, which is equivalent to radical 10. And that can't be simplified at all. So my answer is just radical 10. Okay, our last example. This time I have a hypotenuse. I need to work backwards to get the leg. So I know radical 2 is equivalent to x radical 2 on my formula triangle. I need to divide by radical 2 to get x by itself. So what is radical 2 divided by radical 2? That is 1. So x is equivalent to 1. That means my legs have a length of 1.